Good morning. We will give everybody a few more minutes to join and then go ahead and we still have quite a few rolling in, so we'll give them a couple more minutes. Thanks for your patience. All right, so this morning we got a couple questions that came in over the last week, so we will go over those and then spend the rest of our time doing any open Q&A that y'all might have. So if you have questions, you can feel free to start putting those in the chat box while James goes through what we did receive this week.
All right, thank you, Shelby. So I did have, as Shelby said, just a couple of points I wanted to cover, and I'm going to go ahead and sort of couch this with, these are moderately technical deep dive questions. So if you are someone that is working with actually creating the XML files, if you're a vendor who's working with EHRs, this will be relevant to you. If you are a provider that's not planning on submitting XML files or not working with that directly, this may be a bit more of a technical deep dive than you're used to, but hopefully the information is useful. So I'm going to go ahead and share here. And hopefully, Shelby, can you see my the Word document here?
I can, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so one of the questions that came in, and I know these diagrams can be a bit overwhelming, so I tried to just sort of cut out one section of it, was about whether a particular sub-entity of a bigger entity is one-to-many or one-to-one. And what I've called out here is we're looking at the admissions section here of the data warehouse diagrams. Admissions obviously is part of treatment episode. And I want to sort of call attention, and I will be sending this document out. This is something that I was working on before the meeting, and you'll be getting this document soon. What I wanted to call out was, you'll notice there are sort of two types of boxes within admission. You have a single entity like admission substance use and admission mental health. And then you have a container, which is a container that ends in a plural containing objects in the singular. So you can see, for example, within admission, there's a section called admission substance use. Now, the rules for whether this section is required or not, or when it's required, are in the submission guide. But what I wanted to specifically call out here was whether or not this section is allows multiple entries. Here we can see there's just one box, admission substance use, and that means there's an admission substance use section within admission that can exist or not exist, but there's only one of them. There will only be one of them, and that's the maximum that there can be. And again, if you want to know if it's required or not, that is in the submission guide. But if you look at the performance outcome measures container, you see there's performance outcome measures with an S, and then within that, there's performance outcome measure. And that construction is an indication that there's actually the potential for more than one of these objects within the admission. So within admission, you have a container called performance outcome measures with an S, and within that, you may have multiple performance outcome measure individual records. It's probably worth noting, just because it's a little bit different and I don't want it to confuse everyone. The tab here on discharge versus there's no tab on admission substance use, that's getting into the sort of conventions of the document, but the important thing here is that there is only one discharge, but within discharge, you can see that there are multiple performance outcome measures. And I'm actually going to skip over to the XML for just a minute. And I know this is, again, a bit of a technical deep dive, but this is a sort of XML fragment of a submission for a treatment episode. And you can see here within an admission, here's an admission section. So within the admissions section, this is one admission, and this is a second admission. And I'm kind of trying to stress that these are the singulars, and they exist within this container that has a plural. And then within the admission section, the individual admission section, you have the performance outcome measures container, which contains multiple performance outcome measure records. So that's sort of talking about whether you have a one-to-many or one-to-one. The other point I wanted to make here is the question came in about how you denote that an admission is part of a treatment episode, and sort of where you would put the parent source record identifier. If you're used to a sort of database model where you would say there'd be a column on an entry on a table that says this is my parent entry ID or my parent source record identifier, you don't need that here, and I'll sort of explain why. I did a very simple model here on the screen. You can see there's a treatment episode that has one performance outcome measure associated with it. Within that treatment episode, there are two admissions, admission 1 and admission 2. Admission 1 has been discharged, and admission 2 is still open. Admission 1 is associated with performance outcome measure B, and the discharge of admission 1 is associated with performance outcome measure C. That's important because that performance outcome measure is part of the discharge, and I'll show you a little bit more of that in a second. Admission 2, because admission 2 will say started on the same day they were discharged from admission 1, actually shares that performance outcome measure. So that's sort of how everything's connected with boxes and arrows. But in a second diagram here, I've changed that to more like the way that's going to look on the diagram, and that's actually going to look in the XML. So you have boxes within boxes here. And this is, again, sort of just to show how the parent-child relationships might work. You have a treatment episode. Within that treatment episode, you have a performance outcome measure. You have 2 admissions. The first admission has a performance outcome measure and a discharge. Within the discharge, there's a performance outcome measure. The second admission references this performance outcome measure. You can see that this is performance outcome measure C. And I have spoken before about source record identifiers. In this diagram, I've made sure to put a source record identifier on everything. So we have treatment episode 901, performance outcome measure A, B, C, and the 2 admissions, and discharge 99. And this is a sort of foundation to actually how this is going to look in the XML. And this is, again, a sample of XML, and you don't need to read all of it. And if this is a deeper technical dive, then you're interested. I'm not going to I'm not going to judge you for your eyes glazing over a bit, but we're almost through it. So what I wanted to call out here, though, is within the treatment episode dataset, within provider treatment episodes, this is one provider treatment episode. And within that episode section, we have a source record identifier. That's 901. And that goes back to this being treatment episode 901. See, we're in a provider treatment episode, and we see a source record identifier of 901. There would obviously, in the production XML, be a whole lot more data in there, but I just put a little bit of information. So we have a source record identifier. We'll say a first contact date. Within the treatment episode, and you can see as we sort of go down, the indentation follows the boxes here in terms of what's inside what. So we say within this treatment episode, we have a section called performance outcome measures. Within that, we have a performance outcome measure. Within that, we have the source record identifier. And actually, I hate to do this live on the call, but I'm going to change the font back to this on this because it's a whole lot easier to read in a fixed width font. So now you can see it's a little, I hope a little clearer. But we have within this treatment episode some information about the source record identifier, the first contact date. Then we have a section of performance outcome measures. Within that, we have the performance outcome measure. And this indentation didn't work, but that should be indented under that. So it looks like that, because these are part of this performance outcome measure. And the other part I wanted to call out here, and again, I will send this document once I've finished cleaning it up. We have an admissions section. So if we went back up to this image here, there's actually a sort of virtual box that contains all of these admissions, and that's called admissions. So within the admissions box, we have instances of admission. And here's the first one, source record identifier 1, that's admission 1. The admission date, it contains a performance outcome measure. I want to scroll down and kind of call out one more thing, which is, you remember back up here, I said we had a shared performance outcome measure. This is a concept that I brought up in an earlier technical assistance call, but it's a little tricky, and I think it's worth reiterating. We create this performance outcome measure within discharge 99, but we reference it in admission 2. And I'll show you how that looks. So here is admission 1, and here is the discharge. So we have discharge source record identifier is 99, discharge date. Within this discharge, we have a performance outcome measure, and that's right here, performance outcome measure, and we have a source record identifier of C. And the reason I'm specifically calling this out is if we scroll down, we see this is the end of admission 1 in the XML. And then here's admission 2. So we go to it, that's the end of admission 1. This is the beginning of admission 2. Admission 2, so we say source record identifier is 2. Admission date, here's our performance outcome measures section. Here's one instance of a performance outcome measure. And I have some notes that describe this, But all I have in this performance outcome measure is source record identifier C. If you note where I actually record the source record, the performance outcome measure, we have a source record identifier, and then we also have the date. Now, obviously, in an actual performance outcome measure, there'd be a whole bunch more information, but I did include the date here to point out you do not need to put in any information for this performance outcome measure, because since we already know performance outcome measure C exists, once that's been defined, we can just say performance outcome measure C is associated with this admission, and that's all you have to do. You can just reference it with that source record identifier. This is actually something you can do if you've already created a treatment episode and are adding another admission. You can actually reference that source record identifier as long as it already exists in the data warehouse. So if you had created sort of through to the end of admission 1, and then in a second XML file a month later, we're creating admission 2, you could do that and you could still just send that source record identifier without any further information. And as long as that source record identifier identified a performance outcome measure within the same treatment episode, then that would work, and it would just pull all that information into that admission. So that is what I wanted to cover in terms of, like I said, kind of a bit of a technical deep dive on XML. I did see one thing come into the chat. Since there are could be two admission records, I think there could be 2 discharge records, one for substance abuse and one for mental health. Absolutely. So in fact, to go back to the model, that is a great question. And actually really helps to go back here to our diagram. And I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit so it's somewhat easier to read. But it's not just that there could be two discharge records. There would have to be 2 discharge records. So one discharge record cannot be shared among admissions. Each admission must have its own unique discharge record. So if you have 2 admissions, then yes, you would need 2 discharges. Okay, so that, as I said, that was a good question. I'm going to open it up if anyone wants to throw something in the chat. Is it possible? Yes, I will be sending this Word document out later today. But yes, please continue. Yeah, no problem. Please continue to put stuff in the chat. If you have something that's a little too long to type and want to say, please unmute me, go ahead and do that too. And I'll just wait a little bit and see if stuff comes in on the chat.
The recording will be posted on the DMH website. I will put that link in the chat box for you.
All of the historical recordings, or most of the historical recordings, have been posted, and I think we're on our way to catching up on them. But the DMH website documentation is a great place to start if you have questions. Particularly if you have a question like, is a field required, or when is a field required, or sort of what are the rules around a field. The resource to go to on that would be the submission guides here. But this is the website. It's dmh.ms.gov/WITS-documentation, and I'll put that in the chat as well. So can you explain the source record identifier connection to the services entry? This was in regards to the facility where the service was provided. Sure, absolutely. So actually, this is a great place to look back at our diagram. And so in service events, The service event is tied to has obviously its own identifier, references a provider, and an episode, and an admission. And if we go back up to diagram at the top of the page, just once, excuse me, couldn't find the mute button fast enough, sorry. But if we go back up to the top of the page and we look at the service event entity, we see that it is associated to an admission, an episode, and a provider. And actually, that is, I am sorry, that is the arrow I was missing. I thought it was on treatment episode, it was on service event. So a service event is associated to a provider, I know I had said there was an arrow. I'm actually going to write that down right now so that I don't miss it next time. Thanks, Bree. So I'm, yep, sorry. But yes, the episode is associated with a provider, and excuse me, the service event is associated with an episode, an admission, and a provider. So if you have a, if you're creating a service event, you must have the source record identifier of the provider, the treatment episode, and the admission to which it's associated. So Denise, does that answer your question, or did you want me to go into a little more depth, or? Okay, does anyone have any questions about service events, or? Okay, thanks, Denise. I'll continue to just leave the chat open for a bit. If you have questions or concerns, by all means. But is there any way to get around the start and end times for service event? We have total duration as well as number of units. Okay, Connie, are you asking if there's a way to not have them or not provide them, or is it, or did you have a different question? And while you respond to that, I'll pull up the submission guide for service event. Start and end date are required. Yeah, start and end date are required on the service event. So with the system as it is now, there is no way to put to get around putting in a start and end date. You would need to put in a start and end date. The times, and actually the start time and end time are both optional. So start time and end time are optional, and start date and end date are required. Okay. So okay, yeah. If you have dates but not times, that's fine. The start date and end date are, excuse me, start time and end time are optional. You just need to provide the start date and end date. And just to sort of clarify, if you are not sending something, and this is a question that's come up before, but I wanted to make sure that I sort of reiterated this. If you have sorry, train of thought. If you have a data element that you're not sending, you don't need to send that section in the XML. So if I go back to this XML, and I am 90% sure the performance outcome measure date is required. I'm gonna see if I can blow that up so you can actually read it. So we're in the XML. If performance outcome measure date was not required, you do not have to do this. you can actually do this. You can just delete the whole thing, and the import will run fine. Obviously, the system will validate your XML. So for example, if you did this, you would get an error because you have a start tag without an end tag. But as long as you have the start tag and end tag, or just delete the section entirely, then you're fine. All right. Any other questions? Is there anything someone would like more information on, or a concept that's still a little fuzzy to you that you'd like me to explain in a little bit more depth? I'll give it another minute or two. Oh, the delete process. Sure, absolutely. That's a good one. Okay, so the way documents are deleted, and I had some documentation on that. It's not at my fingertips, but I can actually show you how this works with. I can show you how this works with the XML that I'm looking at. Deletes and updates. Okay, sure. So I'll start with deletes because deletes are actually easier. I'm actually going to pull up. I have some examples that should help. Thanks, Bobby. Actually, I'm going to pull them up. I have the examples. I had, like I said, I had a document where I had gone into exactly how deletes and undeletes work, but I can send that out resend that out after the meeting. There we go. So I'm going to do this. This is how you do a delete, and it's really tiny. There's really not much to send. In previous webinars, I've talked about how the source record identifier can be used for deletes, and this is an example of how that's done. So here, this is all that needs to be sent to delete an entire provider treatment episode. So we start the XML the same way we would for submitting or updating, where we have the XML overhead. We have we say we're in the treatment episode data set. We're in the provider treatment episodes container. We're in a provider treatment episode. And you can see that in that first tag, we say action equals delete. There is a process where you actually have to name the file delete, and there's a series of steps to go through on how you delete objects, because deleting objects, there's kind of a hierarchy to it, and if you don't do it in the right order, you can actually have some problems. So as I said, there is an order to it, but this is what it would look like in the delete file. And I'm with my other eye trying to see if I can, here we go. I found the deletions document. Okay. So let me just finish what I'm talking about here, and then I'll bring up the document and we can sort of go through the rest of it. So what you have to do is you have to reference, using whatever you would have referenced to create the object, you have to reference the object with this action equals delete tag. So in the case of a treatment episode, you need to uniquely identify that treatment episode, which we do via source record identifier and provider source record identifier, and just say action equals delete, and that will delete it. If you do that accidentally, you want to undelete it, you would send an action equals undelete, and that would undelete it. So two more things I want to talk to on this. One is on here, if we go to the submission guide for treatment episode, and we go down to the treatment episode object, you'll see at the beginning of each section, there's a section called key fields in most sections. In the sections where you can delete an entity, it says key fields, and this is really important language to note here. I'm going to sort of zoom in so we can actually read it. The fields in this entity that will be used to uniquely identify a record to determine whether to create or update an existing record and to delete an existing record are these: source record identifier and provider source record identifier. In the context of treatment episode, that's what you would need to send to delete the whole record. But if we search the document for and to delete, to delete an admission, you would just need to send the admission source record identifier. To delete a discharge, the source record identifier, and so forth. Though, to sort of get to the point of deleting the discharge, what you would need to do is go down into the XML and what you would do. So if we were in the context of deleting an admission, we'd go provider treatment episode, and within that, we've identified that. And so now I'm saying within this provider treatment episode, I would say admissions. And within that admissions section, we have admission. And within that admission, actually I would say admission action equals delete. I'm not sure if you need quotes, it's in the previous example, but and then you would say and that would be how you would delete the admission. So you have to sort of, when you're doing a deletion, you have to sort of drill down to the level where you can identify the particular record. One second, sorry. Let me pull this other document up. Give me just a moment to do that. One more thing I did want to point out. It is important when you're submitting XML files that you keep those XML files and you organize them however you want to and however you need to. Once those files have been submitted to the data warehouse, you cannot retrieve them from the data warehouse. So it's really important, especially in the context of troubleshooting, to know, you submitted this file on this date. Just for your own records, for your own troubleshooting, I would highly recommend having some sort of very organized file structure where you know what you did on what day, so that if you do need to troubleshoot, you can reference those files. So let me pull up this document on deletion. We can go through that a little bit, and then we'll talk about updates, because updates are a lot easier. So this is actually in the context of deleting what I call a root entry. So instead of deleting, for example, an admission, deleting an entire treatment episode or an entire client or an entire service event. So I did misspeak slightly earlier. You can delete sub-entities, like you can delete admissions within a regular XML file. But if you want to delete an entire top-level root entry, like a treatment episode, a client record, or a service event, you need to send a separate XML file. And I will send this document as well after the meeting. So the first thing is you need to send deletes of top level objects in a separate file. And if you're deleting multiple data sets, then you must send the deletions in the order here. And this is a note that if you delete an object, everything under the object is deleted. And this is a really important concept to understand because of how soft deletes work. So if you're not familiar with soft deletes, what this does is if I say I want to delete this treatment episode, what that does is in the system, it flags that treatment episode as deleted. And what I say here is if you flag the treatment episode as deleted, everything under the treatment episode is deleted as well. That delete flag cascades down. It's really important to understand that the undelete does not cascade. So if we go back up to this treatment episode record, if I delete a treatment episode, all admissions will be deleted, all performance outcome measures for those admissions will be deleted, all discharges for the admissions will be deleted, and all functional assessments will be deleted, all diagnoses will be, everything within that treatment episode record will be deleted. If I undelete, only the treatment episode is restored. And there are several reasons that happens, but one of the biggest ones is, and the easiest to understand, is there's no indication between this was deleted, or there's no differentiation between this was deleted in the context of I'm deleting the whole treatment episode, and this was deleted just in the context of this one particular admission should be deleted. So if you had, and again, this is a bit down into the technical weeds, but I'll try to keep it fairly high level. If you had 3 admissions within a treatment episode, and you deleted one, you now have a live treatment episode with 2 admissions, and then you go in and delete the whole treatment episode. If you were to undelete everything within the treatment episode, it would undelete all 3 admissions and not just the 2 you wanted. So rather than do that, if you want to undelete something, you have to undelete, if you delete a top level object and it cascades down, or if you delete an admission and it cascades down, you have to restore the objects individually, and it's really tedious. So even though it is a soft delete, and even though it's just setting a flag, I want to really stress that deletions are something that should not be taken lightly, and undeletes can be tedious and cumbersome, and it's something that should be avoided. Only delete something if you really want to delete it. That said, if you want to delete a top level object, this is how you do it. You need to send a separate file. This is a note saying everything under that will be deleted. This is talking about the soft delete and how, and this kind of goes through exactly what I was talking about and how soft deletes cascade down. And we undeleted. This is talking about when you attempt to do a delete, it will the rules will be checked. So for example, if you have a if you delete an admission within a treatment episode, and it's the last admission, that delete will fail because treatment episode requires 1 admission. And actually, I think that's not a rule. Sorry, I apologize. But if there's a rule that requires an object, and you attempt to delete, and the deletion would cause a rule to be violated. For example, a discharge must have 1 performance outcome measure. If you delete the only performance outcome measure in a discharge, you won't be able to do that. The delete will fail, and it'll say you can't do that because discharge requires a performance outcome measure. And this is talking about how a client record is created here with a source record identifier for the client and the provider. And then, so to create it, we just put those source record identifiers in. And this actually, this meshes nicely because this is an update. This is how an update would work. Again, you're uniquely identifying a record with those 2 source record identifiers for client. And that is a great question about treatment episode delete, and I will speak to that in just a second. So if you're doing an update, you send those unique identifiers, and then you just send what changed. So if we wanted to change the last name on a provider client record, all you have to do is send what's changed. If you send everything, that's fine. It won't hurt anything, but anything that you changed will be updated. But you only have to send the information that's changed. And again, there's no action required to create, no action required to delete. And here is how one could delete a physical address. So I'm sending, again, that unique information to identify the client, and within that client object, a physical address deletion. And Prasad, yes, you're absolutely right. I was you took the words right out of my mouth. If we go back to the beginning of this document, there's an order in which you need to delete. So you would need to delete the service events associated with the treatment episode first, and then you would delete the treatment episode. If you do a treatment episode delete, it will not automatically delete the service event data. So that's why you have to do the deletes cascading in this order. But to just sort of wrap up what I was saying about updates. So yeah, updates, you only need to send what's changed. And as long as you go back to the treatment episode, as long as you go back to the treatment, to the submission guide and see what is required to uniquely identify a record, then that's what you need to provide when you do the delete. Will they stay out as orphans, or will it give you an error? That is a great question. I don't know off the service event. So if we go back up, so the question that came in the chat was about this cascading delete. So first you delete service events, then you delete treatment episodes, then you delete clients. And if you don't do that, if you just decide to delete a client and that client had 100 treatment episodes and each of those had 5 service events, would those stay out there as orphans, or would you get an error when you tried to delete the client? Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, and I can double check that, and I will get back to you. Yeah, no problem.
This is Shelby. I'm pretty sure it gives an error, but
okay.
Definitely check. I'm glad you haven't delete yet, Bree.
Yeah, if you try to delete something that doesn't exist, you would get an error. Okay, next question that came in. Will we be able to view our stored data within the warehouse, or are we limited to the user interface? That I believe Denise did respond to that reporting is coming, and you will be updated on that.
Yeah, so you won't be able to pull out your XML files, but providers will be able to have access to reports to see what's in there. So the XML won't be visible, but the data will.
We won't be able to export it back to you if you needed it. I believe you would be able to export the reports in some format, but it would not be in the original format. Is that accurate, Shelby?
Yeah, you won't be able to get your XML files back, but you'll be able to get reports.
And that is why I said, you need to make sure you have your original XML files as reference. Just that's really useful for troubleshooting. Oh, big question came in. Let me open up my chat window a bit here. To clarify, if exactly the same source record identifier is referenced in a discharge performance outcome measure and an admission performance outcome measure, but contains different data values, will the POM sets be associated separately to the admission? So if you had, so I think I understand the question. So you have the admission performance outcome measure is C, and the discharge performance outcome measure is C, but the admissions performance outcome measure says the date was July 1st, and the discharge says it's July 7th. No, it will not be associated separately. I believe what would happen there is that you would get an error that performance outcome measure source record identifier needs to be unique within the treatment episode. You can reference the same performance outcome measure, but I believe if you put anything more than the source record identifier in, and you have, again, source record identifier C in one place with a bunch of data, and source record identifier C in another place with just the source record identifier, that's fine. But I think if there's any data there, you'll get that error message. I can actually double check that. I'm 80% sure on that, so I can double check that while we're, hopefully while we're on the line.
Yeah, and James, if you want to go back, so if you have done the same performance outcome measure for discharge and then reference it again in your transfer admission, you only need to put that source record identifier. You don't need to put all the data in there again.
In fact, don't put the data in there again.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have anything other than that source record identifier, it's not going to compare the data. Just if you want to reference a source record identifier, just put the excuse me. If you want to reference a performance outcome measure, just put the source record identifier and no further information. If you put anything other than the source record identifier, it's going to say that's a duplicate, because it's going to try to create a second one. So would this be like a functional assessment used for a discharge from one area and an admission? Okay, Prasad, yes, please confirm that, because my understanding is that it should give you an error, and if it's not, then we need to do some investigation on that. So would this be like a functional assessment used for a discharge? Thanks, Prasad. A functional assessment used for a discharge from one area and an admission on another. Let me go back and look at the model so I can make sure I'm saying the right thing. So functional assessment is not associated with a discharge. It's part of an admission. And I believe functional assessment is unique within an admission. And if you put the same source record identifier for a functional assessment in a different admission, it would just treat it as a new functional assessment. But I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm speaking correctly. I believe that's right, but let's look. A functional assessment will be uniquely identified in the data warehouse by the provider's internal identifier for the functional assessment within the admission, known as the source record identifier. And it goes on to say, providers are required to submit a unique source record identifier for each assessment within an admission. Therefore, no two functional assessment records can be submitted with the same source record identifier within the same admission. So, Bree, to answer your question, if I have a functional assessment with a source record identifier of XYZ within admission 1, and I put in source record identifier, a functional assessment with source record identifier of XYZ in assessment 2, if I just put in that source record identifier, I'm going to get errors on whatever required fields are in functional assessment. And if I put in source record identifier XYZ with all the data, it'll just treat it as a new one. So it's that source record identifier is just within that admission. Okay, I see you got it, so I'll stop talking. All right, thank you. But that is actually a really important thing to look at when you're looking at source record identifiers and sort of where you can reference something somewhere else, is this section under description. And there's one of these every time we talk about an object where you can have multiple multiple instances of them. It will say sort of where the uniqueness is and where they're identified. And I believe performance outcome measure is the only object that can be shared between other objects. Is there a report where we can view the data uploaded via the XML, and where are those reports? Denise, I believe, said that those are coming soon.
Yeah, so FEI, we're still building the reporting model that will become available to DMH soon. They will test it and then make it available.
All right, I'll give it a couple more minutes for things to come into the chat. I know that last question was a pretty long one, so if someone's typing, I'll give them a chance to do that.
David, do you mean the SFTP? So we are working on it. We're still waiting on an amendment from DMH, but we have started development on that. So it's in progress.
All right, that looks like it may be about it. if you are typing a question, oh, here comes one. My apologies if this was already mentioned. When will the recording of this webinar be posted for viewing? And yes, it will be on that page. And Shelby, I know that I believe the process is for you to send that out.
So I send the recording to DMH. They have to get it converted to a YouTube video and then they post it. I think it typically takes a few days, but I will send it to them this afternoon so they can get started on the process.
And again, I'll try to make sure that the documentation that I've been referencing, obviously, some of it, like the treatment episode guide, is already on the DMH website. The other documents, I will make sure that they're either on the DMH website or they get emailed to you, or ideally both. I'm glad it was useful. Thanks, Bree.
James is definitely doing most of the heavy lifting, but I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, if there are no more questions, we will go ahead and end it. If you do have questions this week, you can go ahead and send those to ehrhelpdesk@dmh.ms.gov. I'll put that in here. And we will work to get you helped. Awesome. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.